Chemical Engineering sophomore. She's also involved with the Spanish and Latin Student Association. Then we have Professor Susanna Steppen. She is a teacher in chemical engineering. Next up, we have Barbara Litt, who is an adjunct faculty in Japanese. Then we have Calvin Chan, who is a Meki plus BME senior and is also involved with ARCC, the Awareness of Roots in Chinese Culture. Next up, we have Professor Leonard Piccolo, who is a professor in chemistry. Then we have Giselle Sherwood, who is the chemistry lab instructor. Next up, we have Professor David Cosby, who is a computer science professor. Then we have Iman Mas. She is an international relations and directing junior and is also involved in the Muslim Student Association. Then we have Meg Evans. She is a Steele House Fellow and is also the coordinator of the LGBTQ resources. Last but not the least, we have Koyam Adewumi. She is a junior in biological sciences. So I would like everybody to know that they should feel free to ask any questions to the professors and students on the panel, but we would really like to start with a few questions of our own. My first question, and I would really like my student friends on the panel to answer these questions. First up, how has race impacted or not impacted your classroom experience as a student, house fellow, or as a professor?
Can you repeat the question?
How has race impacted or not impacted your classroom experience as a student, professor, or a house fellow?
I'll just tell you guys a little bit about myself. I grew up in a neighborhood, pure Hispanic, like a Latino community. And I was lucky enough to go to an all-girl Jewish school. So right then and there, I was like in a culture shock. And I think race in high school, I dealt a lot with like racial issues and kind of that prepared me when I came to college. So when I came to CMU, I didn't have much of a struggle talking to people outside my race. I mean like different races, but I did see others struggling just like talking to their own race, which is completely understandable because I know I can relate more to other Hispanics on campus. But when it comes down to like classroom, I think that race, I am like very proud of being Hispanic, and I think that there was like somewhat of a pressure for me to do well in the courses because I wanted to prove the stereotypes like of the successful Latinas in engineering, that there are people capable of doing that, and I guess that was my goal coming here.
Thanks so much.
Just so people have a little bit more background, I grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii, in a very diverse community. And the school that I went to had a lot of students of mixed races. So it wasn't really until coming to CMU that I really understood that people do have these boundaries set up in terms of race. Because where I'm from, people are of Asian and white descent, Asian and of black descent, black and white descent, Mexican. Everyone is just one big melting pot coming together. So when I first came here, it was really weird because I was kind of like a fish out of water in the sense that when I first got here, everyone is like separated out, and like some of the Asian students would sit together, some of the white students would sit together, and I'm like, when I first got here, I'm like, okay, I guess I'll try to sit up front because I really don't know of these groups where else to sit. So after a while, I am now a senior, and I got to get to know everyone else in the senior Meki class really well. And I think that in terms of race, we really don't divide ourselves anymore. We kind of divide ourselves along like who likes to have fun and how much we like to suffer together. So, in a sense, that CMU does really bring us together through work and stress.
So I'm Iman, and I don't really feel like race has ever been a barrier at CMU for me in my classroom experience. I believe that it might have even helped bring attention to me. I wear a headscarf, which is something that's kind of rare on this campus. And I know that one of my international relations professors was interested in seeing, why I was in the class, and she struck up a conversation. And I feel like probably if I didn't wear a headscarf, I wouldn't have gotten that initial attention and that initial question. And the same thing happened for my theater classes. The head of the School of Drama approached me one day and was like, "Hi, who are you?" And I don't think that I would have gotten that if I had just been, if I had looked like everyone else. I think diversity has helped me in my experience at CMU.
Hi. Wait, can you repeat the question again? Sorry. So, how has race impacted or not impacted your classroom experience as a student, professor, or a housewife?
Okay, so for example, on Tuesday, I walked into my class and there were 5 other African American people, African American language, African people in that class. And I remember pulling out my phone and texting my friends like, "You guys, oh my gosh, there are 5 other people." Because most of the time I walk into a classroom and it's either me or 2 other African American people and I know their names. And everybody knows each other's names because it's that few people, and I hadn't actually grown up with that because where I'm from, there are tons of different people of different cultures, and you were never really identified by your race or your culture, more so what you were doing in the community at that time. So CMU was the first time that's ever really been a thing. That I'm I can point to you and I know your name. Why do I know your name? Because you're Black in CMU.
As Calvin said, that stress culture CMU is stressful. So, next up. So, does culture contribute to the stress culture here at CMU? For example, having a tiger mom or feeling you have to do well because you feel that you are representing your family or other people who have similar background to you.
I know a lot of Asian Americans have the stereotype of having the tiger mom, of having the parent really pressuring you to push you and do well because they see you as the first generation that really does have a chance in America because they worked not to come to America, not so that they have the opportunity to do well and succeed, but so that us as the children have the opportunity to do well and succeed. But my parents never really saw it that way. They saw it that they believe I have a better chance of being happy here. So I think after around the age of 10, my parents really stopped pressuring me to do well in school because they knew I could do it by myself. And they started pressuring me to do what you want to be happy and do what you really enjoy. In fact, contrary to a lot of stereotypes, when I first decided I wanted to be an engineering major, my parents were like, are you sure that's what you want to do? We know you really like theater. Are you sure you don't want to pursue that? So I told them, Mom, I really do like theater, but it's easier to do that with a mechanical engineering degree than it is to do the other way around. So in terms of stress culture, I grew up in a really lucky situation where my parents were supportive of me no matter what. So when I came to CMU and there is this stress culture around, it helps keep me in check and remember what's important, and that's to try to be happy, because that's what my parents really want for me.
Other people at the panel?
For me, I do think I have a lot of stress, but not because of my parents, more so the stress I put on myself. Like where I come from, not many students go to college, so I feel like I have a duty to be an example to everyone in my community, and as well as my siblings and other like relatives. And so I think trying to succeed and at the same time like trying to get like just do well and be someone important, be someone influential, and come back and kind of give back to my community is what is stressing me out to do well. And you know, CMU is hard enough already, and I think that just adds on to more pressure for me.
Okay, so I have like a tiger mom. I guess like growing up African, it wasn't if you're going to college, it's where you're going to college and what your college is ranked. So then it was always like all my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, like they had degrees, and like for some reason, most of the time you're either a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. That's it. So there was a lot of pressure to be that and do it well. And like, come on, you gotta be a little better than your cousin over there, because like your mom and her mom got in an argument like 3 years ago. So, yeah.
I just wanted to say, touch on something Gabby had said earlier. I think whether it's consciously or unconsciously, you do have some sort of pride in your nationality or race, whatever you want to call it. And so the fact that people do, maybe the only person that they've ever met from your race, and you're it, so you want to do the best. And so you do put more stress on yourself when you feel like you're representing your nationality or your country or your race.
I'm gonna ask the next question. This one is a good one. A lot of minority students in the US will talk about a concept called white privilege. What exactly is white privilege? And why is it that when minority students talk about it, they're often told they're playing the race card?
Does anyone actually have a definition? I do not have a definition, but I would like to speak to white privilege.
I don't know anything, so you know.
Okay. Well, I was born in 1960. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, where I knew about 4 black people, and for me, race has mainly been colored by that, by black, white, and I'm as white as they come. I have super white skin, I burn easily, all that, but I think white privilege is growing up in a society where you have a sense of entitlement, you have a sense of safety. The police are your friends, you're raised that way to trust them. You don't have any clue that people who aren't like you go through things like being followed when they go into a store. The fact that other white people say really nasty things in front of me because they think I share their values and expect me to agree with them is a kind of white privilege as well. And I used to just be silent. Now I tend to question them more than I used to. I think I'll stop there.
So I remember when I first learned the term white privilege, I tried wrapping my head around it. I started thinking a lot in terms of like mathematics. Maybe I can find a way to work in the white privilege. And for me, I define it as more of a white factor. Whereas, yes, there's a lot of things that happen in terms of success, such as how hard you're willing to work, how lucky your family was to be born where it is. But for me, the white privilege factor is kind of a sense that's like a multiplier of 1 or 0.1. And in terms of mathematics, if you have that white privilege, say you're from a very white family, from a white suburban neighborhood, you have a higher chance of succeeding and doing well and not falling victim to like police injustice or people saying bad things about you. Whereas if your white privilege factor was like 0.1, say you're from a bad neighborhood, from a bad upbringing, you have a neighborhood that is you're from a race that is habitually victimized by the media. You have a much lower chance of succeeding because of external factors that you can't control. So being Asian American, we're always asked, what does white privilege mean to you? And because Asians, we're relatively new to the US, and we come in a lot more different shades in terms of skin color. We do experience all across the spectrum of the white privilege factor. Because I remember back in my younger days, I was on a class trip to somewhere in, I think, Georgia for robotics competition. And one of the most striking things told to me was, in this class, I think we were 98% Asian with one white person among us. But being all Asian, we were all different skin colors. I had friends who were like the pasty white Asian that made our white person look a little bit dark. And I had like Asian friends that are very much dark. They spend all day out surfing, and there's like really, really dark Asians. And when they went to a store, this owner was like, well, those dark people over there were probably more prone to get into crime, so he had them followed. And it was just kind of weird because, like, yes, we're all Asian, but clearly our skin color played a factor into how we were viewed by the outside community.
So now I know. So now coming back to my first question, and this time I would like my professors on the panel to answer the question. How has race impacted or not impacted your classroom experience as a professor?
So for me, the idea of race is more of a perception of who you are and who you should be. I'm black for the first time in years. Like in 2002 when I came to Carnegie Mellon, I realized I was black. Well, because I'm from the Caribbean, and I think like Najee had said earlier, there isn't this concept of black and white as there is in America. And I had spent my undergrad years in New York with a lot of Caribbean people. So when I came to CMU, it was like, okay, you are black. You are the token black. You are supposed to be there. As a professor, it's more of for a race and sort of a gender type thing. So black females are often perceived as angry or aggressive. So if I were to say to someone, oh, please don't do that, oh my God, she's trying to scare me. Why is she yelling? Why? You know, I'm afraid to go speak to her. She's going to yell at me. I'm having a conversation, I'm direct. My culture makes me a lot more blunt than most other cultures. So my tendency to speak to people is very direct. And I feel oftentimes when students encounter me, they have a perception of who a black woman should be and how they act or how they think they act. And so you can see in their interactions, in the way they come to me, in the way they talk to me, that that's written in their face before they begin to hear exactly what I'm trying to say or believe that I'm trying to help them. So that for me is sort of the impact, not just a race thing, but more so a gender thing.
For me, Carnegie Mellon as an environment has been completely enriching. This is where I got to meet so many different people and learn about so many people. So as a graduate student and then also as a faculty member, I think for me, it's enriched everything because not just for physical attributes or cultural attributes or whatever of different races or ethnicities, but also learning styles. It helped me to think a little bit more about how people from different parts of the world learn differently and to be a little more sensitive even toward that, to try to be an effective teacher or to just be willing to change your teaching style and just be respectful of or mindful of a lot of different learning styles. And I think that's still something for me that I'm trying to focus on or understand. Of course, that comes with a lot of communication. You know, it's helpful when students do come and talk to you and give you that feedback. So I know I appreciate that. I think the diversity and different cultures have brought that ability for me to realize that a little bit more.
Well, I'm just going to reinforce the same theme that I think it's just an embarrassment of riches that we've enjoyed as faculty here, because we get to work with so many diverse people of every background imaginable. And when I was younger, I had a fairly diverse experience, I would say. I grew up in a lower middle class neighborhood, then a middle class, then an upper middle class neighborhood. Dad kind of progressed economically. But best friend was Korean when I was younger. When we moved to San Diego, my best friend was Mexican. My brother's wife was Mexican. Grew up in a world that seemed, I don't know, not to really have a lot of the issues that we're talking about in my immediate life, but I'm no idiot and can see it all around me, right? So anyway, so here is just reinforcing the lovely positives, but also sometimes the negatives. You can hear conversations that are laced or toned with phrases that probably ought not be there. You can see sometimes self-imposed segregation going on within communities. You can see a lot of what we're talking about, that we're not a perfect place here, but we're about as good as I've ever seen anywhere. And I've just loved participating and partaking in this. And I'll say sometimes, I have these biases I don't even know I have, of course. Just give you one example. I was talking to a faculty member who happens to teach at CMU Cotter, and he teaches my course there. You can figure out who he is based on that. And once a year, at a minimum, we get together and talk, and he's a wonderful person and a fantastic teacher. And we were talking at one point about cultural differences, and somehow I said something that seemed to be tinged with a judgment about arranged marriages, which is common where he comes from. And he's in the middle of a lovely, fantastic, wonderful arranged marriage. And he walked me through like how he couldn't understand how someone would want it the other way. And how like a family so caring and loving, reaching out and finding the right person for you. And I had tripped onto this blind spot of mine. And it was so wonderful to have light shine on that blind spot and for me to not have it anymore. And things like this happen all the time here. And I think that we're very fortunate to have this community, even while we still have a lot of work to do, because I think everyone does.
Do we have people in the audience? Okay.
So in one of the classes I teach, Introduction to Japanese Language and Culture, we explicitly address culture. And a big part of that is sharing our own culture and examining our own cultural biases. So, of course, I try very hard to make the environment in the class comfortable so everyone feels like they can do that. And but I also worry that perhaps, well, I know that I have my own biases, as I told you, and that perhaps there might be people who walk in and see me and hear me on the first day of class and decide that they don't want what I have for them. And perhaps that may be based on a perception of me and my race or my way of saying things. And I try to be politically correct, but I still worry. I feel insecure that I may be projecting something that I don't mean to. But I want to echo, thank goodness for all of your diversity. It makes my class so much more interesting. And thank you.
So, do we have people in the audience who would like to ask some questions to our people on the panel? Kiran?
So, it's pretty easy to be complacent that CMU is so diverse. It's a word that we splatter around in our admissions essays. Like, I'm sitting with people of different races here. Well done. But I don't feel like this is diversity. I don't know what diversity is. Could you please tell me what diversity is to you?
Well, I'll tell you what diversity is not. I've done some outreach in the region, and I go into regional schools and try to do my part. And I'll go into a school which is overwhelmingly poor and overwhelmingly black, where the people are The students, of course, are young and bubbly and wonderful, but when you start meeting a family such as you can, they're overwhelmingly troubled in a great variety of ways. There's tremendous uniformity. That's a tremendous lack of diversity. And by the way, for the record, as far as I'm concerned, that relationship between, because I said they're overwhelmingly black and poor, is a serious problem in Pittsburgh. That we have a serious overrepresentation there. And it's a socioeconomic issue, one that you can do something about. I try. I don't know if I can do it right or wrong, but I get in the schools and try. And you can do that too. We could be part of the solution. But that, I'll tell you what, you go to a better, a more successful, more college-oriented high school like Taylor Alderdice nearby here. I don't know if anyone's been in that high school, but walk around the hallways, and what you'll find is it's really two high schools in one, and it's highly segregated again. And one is this richly diverse group of college classes, and one is this richly non-diverse group of everybody else. So I could continue. The point is, the world really is not Carnegie Mellon University. And the world really is not richly diverse in the way that we are. I think the world's a lot better than it was. I think it's got an awfully long way to go, and we have to be the agents of change to make it happen.
So, I'm a faculty member, and getting back to your question about how has race affected my teaching experience here at CMU, and the short answer is not enough. Okay? So I teach a big course, modern biology, and I don't see enough African American faces in that class. Okay? I would like to see more. Okay? I've had some very good students. It's not an easy, it's an intro course, it's not an easy course, because you cover a lot of stuff. Okay? Kanye was one of my students 4 years ago. Okay? But I would like to see more, especially African American students in that course. Okay? I also have a comment. My children went mostly through the Pittsburgh public schools, my 3 children. They're grown now, but all 3 of them went to Taylor Alderdice High School. And I know the situation that you described there. Okay? My children were in classes at different levels in the school. Okay? All of them would say today that the diversity of Taylor Alderdice was, the high diversity of Taylor Alderdice was a very important part of growing up in Pittsburgh.
Professor.
Okay, so I'm in STEM field, and I just want to say, so there's a privilege to being white in America. There's also a privilege to being male anywhere in the world. So, as a minority woman in a STEM field, a lot of times you'll hear like little jabs and comments about, how, she'll probably go on the doctorate track, but she'll probably fall off and get pregnant. Like, it's not like funny, when these things happen. So I guess this would be more for the STEM professors or students that are on the panel. Like, how do you think we can encourage, I guess, minority women or women in general in these STEM fields to, have a more positive outlook on their lives? Because it's a lot of the comments, sometimes I've even heard them at CMU classes when I've taken like my bio or even my chem class. So, and I don't like it. And there are other women in my class, they hear it too, and it's just like, these aren't really funny. So how could you as professors or you as even students who have been through these courses and maybe have heard these comments, like how do you, look that up?
All right, I'm a chemical engineer, obviously, since that's my department where I teach. And I don't recall when I was in college anybody ever saying that to me. I believe that it probably, some people might have been thinking it. But what I do with my students, like Carnegie and a few others that I've had in my intro to CMU, is when they come talk to me about their careers, I encourage them as much as I can. I do not even touch on the point that, because you're a woman and you're probably going to have children and drop off, the career. And I tend to share with them a lot about my path, I guess, and how I came in the roundabout going to CMU. So I worked in industry for years, and yes, it is a male-dominated world, and as a female, there's challenges to it, but you can do it, and if you're good, and you're recognized, and so you don't really have to make it about, you don't even have to think, oh, well, because I'm a woman, I have to do this, that, or the other thing. But I mean, the obvious fact is that, yes, hopefully you're gonna, find a wonderful man and marry and have children if you're lucky. And so you will have to make changes, and they're not necessarily bad. You can take some time off. I was sharing with Barbara earlier, so I left my full-time job, but I came here because academia is way more accommodating to the female mothers, I guess to the mothers. And I stayed in my field, and now that my children are grown, I came back full time, and I'm again fully contributing to society, I guess, as a woman engineer, and I just reinvented myself. So for you ladies in the same fields or in any other field, don't lose heart. You can reinvent yourself and be just as successful.
Just to add to that point, I found that for most minority students who I've had an interaction with, most of the times they come to me to speak to me about being in science. It's never necessarily that it's a gender or thing, it's personally how you feel about yourself. So most of my students, I think, who start to tape off at the end, usually it's because of their own insecurities and what they think people's perceptions of them are. So they get into a classroom, they do poorly on one exam, and it sort of funnels from this idea that, okay, these minority students can't do well, so then they feel the pressure of the world on them, and therefore they themselves think they can't do well. And I've often found that just sort of taking that out of your head, or me having a conversation with a student saying that it's not, you don't need to be intimidated by other people's successes or any race or any culture, that you just really have to look inside of yourself and see what you want to do and to sort of celebrate the people around you. And in that way, I think that's what's diverse. Like you look at someone who's doing well, and instead of saying, okay, I'm not as smart as them, ooh, they know quanta, therefore they can help me learn quanta. So it's not just that I don't know it, and I'm not the smartest person, and I'm just another group, a minority who's just not doing well. I think that is a bigger issue. And this also stems from the fact that I came from an all-girls school, and when I was growing up, I was never told I couldn't. So for me, the idea that I can't because I'm female, or I can't because I'm black, has never been a part of who I am. And it's odd to me that it's a part of any student at Carnegie Mellon. My perception usually is you got into Carnegie Mellon, you're brilliant, right? So it's odd to me that students come to me and say they can't. And they themselves see the diversity amongst themselves, and sort of their insecurities is really, I think, what the bigger problem is, rather than a race type thing, where they really can't do it.
Speak to this point, I strongly believe that this whole world is part of a competition. Even when we're at CMU, we're all competing to gain a better education. And when some people feel threatened by other people in their classrooms, they're going to make comments that they feel, will put someone down. And whether that's racist comments or sexist comments, people are going to try and hurt other people's feelings in order for them to get the leg up. But that just proves that you don't have the skills to get the leg up on your own, and you feel that you have to resort to using derogatory terms and words and sentiments. So I believe that when someone exudes that kind of negativity, you need to squash it, whether by talking to them on a one-to-one level or by ignoring their comments, whatever you feel the situation really needs. So I feel that that's something that we need to work on ourselves and understand that we shouldn't make nasty comments just because we feel threatened at someone else's success. We should be working together to help each other in an ideal world. but we are the USA and there's capitalism.
Okay, so I did an ethnography for stress culture at CMU, and I wanted to see how men and women were stressed in comparison to each other. So women were stressed out 88% to 72% for men, and I wanted to know why women were more stressed out. And a lot of it was that, so I was interviewing women, and one of my friends, she worked at SpaceX for 2 years, and everyone was, like the guys that she worked with made comments about how she was a woman and how she couldn't do what they could do, but they were still at the same company. Or one of my friends, she was interning at Bank of America, and everyone expected less of her, or she had to do so much more to be able to do the jobs that the men were telling her that they could do. But at the end of the day, she was still at Bank of America, and she was interning at Bank of America. And so it was a lot of women who were being very, very successful and having men tell them all the time that, like, oh, you're not going to be as successful, you can't do this, or you have to work harder. But at the end of the day, they were succeeding in what they were doing. So yes, in women in STEM fields, you're going to get so many comments about how you can't do it as well as they can, or you shouldn't be as successful, or because you're a woman, you're not as successful as them. But historically speaking, you can find tons of women that you can look up on Google and look up to that have done what you're trying to do and did it well, despite the fact that men are all around them telling them not to do it or that they can't do it. But they still did it, and you can too.
So, I have a question to Meg and all my other student friends. So, how does race affect the dorm life at the CMU campus?
That's a good question. I think that a lot of our programming tends to be really white. So a lot of what we do is kind of cultural, right? It's a lot of what, as white folks, we expect to happen, and we program a lot around that. So what we do from a residential perspective is with our community advisors, resident advisors, work with them to figure out how we can make our programming, the ways we interact with folks, much more inclusive. And I did want to speak, you asked the question 100 years ago about white privilege and the race card, and we haven't talked about that yet. I think as white folks, when we first hear about this idea of white privilege, it's this instant like guilt to say, oh no, that's not me, I haven't benefited from that, right? Because we want to think as white folks, light-skinned folks, that we have worked really, really hard to get where we are, and we have. White folks in this room, you've done a really good job. You're at Carnegie Mellon, right? I'm not taking that away from anybody, but I think our privilege is that we never ever have to think about that, right? We never have to represent our race when we're in a classroom. We never have to represent our race when we're talking to our friends, right? We just don't have to do that, and that is a privilege. White privilege is inherently never having to think about race. That is the privilege. End of story, right? It's just never having to think about it. And so the race card we kind of use as a way to throw that back in folks of color in their face, right? To say, no, that's just the race card, because I have this guilt of being a white person, and so I'm just gonna say you're using the race card because I don't want to think that I have this extra privilege. And so I think that's why the race card is used so often. I thought I was just like, yeah, I'm getting it. I don't know. Right? So I think as white folks, we have to challenge ourselves to figure out what that is. What privilege do we have as white and light-skinned folks that we just get to kind of push against that privilege, right? That's how we create change. We don't create change just by telling folks of color, no, y'all are playing the race card. That doesn't change anything, right? The race card exists because it exists. That's not me. Right? So I think there is this really strong link between white privilege and the race card, right? I think it's used against folks of color to say that your opinion is not as valid, and that's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. So I think this is linked that we haven't talked about much much that we're scared to talk about, because white folks sometimes when we learn about privilege, we get really guilty. Like, no, I've never done that. I haven't benefited from that. There's this guilt. When I started learning about this stuff in undergrad 150 years ago, it was actually 15, which is showing my age, right? The first time I learned about it, I was like, I can never talk about this. Maybe nobody will notice I'm white, and then I didn't get all these privileges, right? People noticed that I was white. I don't know if you all can, but we have to begin to link those two and challenge ourselves with our own privilege. That's the way we're gonna kind of create change. So I had to put that out there. That has nothing to do with dorm life, but.
Can I just I mean, we keep talking about, again, because I'm from the Caribbean, and because I've had experiences and I've actually had white friends, when you start talking to them about white privilege and you have a conversation about the race, they sort of bring back affirmative action and problems with affirmative action. I mean, again, Caribbean. No concept of MLK Day until I came here, right? But I think it's important to address both sides of an issue. So when you talk about white privilege and why that's bad and playing the race card, I think you also have to address the issue that some white people have in like what they think is bad about affirmative action, or what they think that they don't benefit from. So I've had a lot of friends or colleagues looked at me and just been really disgruntled by the fact that there's such an awareness when it comes to race, especially for African Americans. So the idea of MLK or having a black graduate student organization. There is no white graduate student organization on campus. There is no National Society of White Engineers on campus. And that offers a bit of an offense sometimes to this, at least I think that's sort of where the controversy becomes, where you have this idea of white privilege and then there's affirmative action, and there's not a real conversation that actually ever happens as to why things happen and why things are done and put into place. And it's a conversation that I think we beat around the topic a lot, but we never talk about. You know, the idea that you can't have like someone say, okay, this is my perspective, this is what I have experienced, and I have kids that are now going to come to school at Carnegie Mellon University, but there's 1% that's supposed to be African Americans. My kids didn't get in, and they're really angry at that. Why don't we have those conversations?
Well, like, what I think is really interesting and why we might need Society of Black Engineers or Society of Black Grad Students is because, for example, when you turn on your TV, and this is more, I guess, less now than before, but when you turn on your TV, the chances are you're gonna see white people. And it's not like, unless you go on like BET or Vibe, which needed to make different stations so you can see other cultures, you're gonna see white people. You open a magazine, you're gonna see white people. You go to a college campus, you're gonna see majority white people. So then people started making groups like Societies of Black Engineers, and I think it's kind of valid, and I think sometimes to be like, why isn't there a Society of White Engineers, it's kind of like, yeah, we just call that engineering. You know? And so now that we have more and more diversity, I guess it's different because CMU is supposed to be a more diverse school, but other schools, you go onto their campus and there's one black person, and they're the Society of Black Engineers. So there's one Hispanic girl, and she is the Society of like Black Hispanic Engineers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not trying to negate.
You were like,
I'm not trying to defend it. I understand why there is. I'm just saying that the conversation comes both ways, you know.
Yeah.
And then when you're having that conversation, it's not just you saying, okay, this is why, because on TV we don't see black people, right? I get it, I understand it, but it's a conversation that I don't think both sides hear, both ends of it, right? And as we become diverse and we become to be different and stuff, then do we still need those things? You know, those are some of the questions that I think people ask. You know, is it just a way of isolating a certain group and bringing sort of a focal point to that group, whereas you don't have that for other things, and it's sort of causing some of these diversity issues that we see.
That we're trying to fight against.
No, we are trying to fight against.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't need a mic.
Is this on? Yeah. I do need a mic. I wanted to a little bit about it because I'm a quiet white person. I want to talk a little bit about affirmative action and where it came from, and the fact that not everyone learns the same history. And I grew up not knowing the history of my country, and I'm sure there are still parts of it I don't know. But it wasn't until I was an adult that I really understood what slavery was, how our country's whole foundation was on it, all the economic gains that were appropriated by white people at the expense of slaves. And not, growing up not knowing that, I didn't really understand why I knew so many black people who were in the ghettos or who were undereducated and all that. And knowing that history, I can see how it's perpetuated itself and where it's come from. Similarly, Chinese people growing up in China today don't know the history of Japan. People in Japan don't know the history of China. People in Japan don't know a lot of history, actually. So we need to know each other's histories, and the winners write history. And I'll stop there.
And can I quickly follow on?
Yeah.
So on the issue of affirmative action, I'm just going to say it's just really, really hard to know what to do. So I've had the tremendous good fortune of not only teaching thousands of CMU students, but even hiring hundreds of CMU students, at least around 150 or so. And so interviewing, since we get about, 10 to 1, so about 1,500 of you have applied for jobs with me. First, thanks. But here's the thing, we have implicitly rejected most of affirmative action without talking about it in 112. What we've done instead is created a fierce meritocracy, and we've supported the heck out of everybody as much as we could, and then let the cream rise. The best rose, and the best assumed positions on the staff. And the staff, I'm very happy to say, has been tremendously diverse. It represents the broad demographics of the university. It succeeds. We won. We've solved the whole problem. Let's go home and celebrate. But we haven't. There actually turn out to be select populations at this university that we have not hired. I'll call out two in particular. We have not had a black or African American staff member, and neither Latino. And it shocks my conscience that this is true. And I have no explanation for it, and I have no defense for it. And everything we've done and everything we've tried hasn't actually worked. I've had tremendously close relationships with extremely successful people of those demographics. This has nothing to do with ability and outcome. So I don't know what the answer is, but I know what we have to do is reinvent ourselves again, and I'm talking about myself here now, to make sure that the demographic on my staff matches the demographic in my classroom. I just don't know what to do about that, and I think that's the biggest problem. A lot of times, we want to make some progress on these issues, but we don't know how. But here's my answer to that. Invent something. Try something, and then when it doesn't work, invent something else. But keep trying to make the world you want it to be, right? That's what Gandhi said. Be the change you want in the world. Don't talk about the change, be the change. So here I am in front of all of you, telling you I want to solve this problem. The last thing I'm going to do is solve it the wrong way, I hope. But here, the best of intentions aren't good enough, and that's the lesson.
So we're down to our last 10 minutes of the panel, and if anybody in the audience has a question, we have a question there.
In response to the killings of Mike Brown and Eric Garner and various other young black males across the country, especially recently, there have been events such as the die-in that was hosted in the UC. What are your feelings or expressions about those type of events, and especially the backlash against them that is claimed that these kinds of events are not necessary?
So I just want to say that those events were truly tragic, and for a lot of minorities in America, that was kind of the wake-up call that there is still an issue with underrepresentation, mistreatment, and historic white privilege factor, whatever, however we choose to define it. And as an Asian American, myself personally, and I know a lot of other Asian Americans out there who are faced with the choice of whose side do we stand on? Because every time people bring up terms like, oh, this is a clash of races, this is a race war, this is a racial thing, people always kind of set out to the dichotomy. It's black versus white, black versus white, black versus white. It's like Asian Americans don't really have a foothold in that conversation. Other races such as Middle Eastern Americans, Caribbean Americans, we all kind of have this bystander effect. They're saying it's race, but it's really, they focus on that. And so as Asian Americans, we usually have the, people say we have the three choices, which are like, we can agree, we can disagree, or we can just try to keep our head down and hope it all blows over. And with the killings of Michael Brown, the Staten Island case, everything coming to light, a lot of Asian American in the community, I'm very happy to say, were very much supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and saying that historic underrepresentation, historic mistreatment is a terrible thing, and that in order to, in the 60 years since we started Martin Luther King Day, since the civil rights case really became active, there's been a lot of progress, but there's still a lot more ways to go. So, like, it's a response to that affirmative action. There's a lot. Why do we have these society of black engineers? Why do we have these society of Asian scientists and engineers? Why do we have these groups? And the hope of these groups is that one day these groups will no longer be needed, in the sense that once Asian representative, once black representation in these fields become more widespread, these groups will no longer need to help bring the population to that thing, and then we can just have a society of mechanical engineers that's as diverse as the population.
Sorry, my opinion on the backlash is that no real change has ever been accomplished without any backlash that's ever happened. I think that as long as protests keep on being peaceful the way they are and not being misrepresented in the news as violent, which they're not, as long as they remain peaceful and active protests and demonstrations, I think they should keep going on. I think they could make a difference. More people notice, more conversations happen. There are Facebook groups, there are people posting, and everyone is listening to other people's opinions, so they really can make a difference. I just think we'll always have to expect backlash. And backlash isn't necessarily a bad thing, because then you overcome the backlash and you're like, yo, we did something.
And then there's the question of the silent majority, right? How many people in this room think what happened was appalling? I think all of us, right? How many people in this room have done something about it? And then a much fewer number of hands go up, and that's the problem, right? You have to convert your beliefs into actions one way or another, whether or not really your core beliefs. This applies to everyone up here just as much as everyone else.
I would also like to just build on what I said before about people not knowing history. They also don't have the same facts. They watch different news. It's very segregated. Who watches Fox News? Who watches? Or I mean, many of us don't watch the news. We get our news self-selected ways. So people have different facts, and so who knows? Are they nonviolent? You really only know if you were there, and you have to choose who to believe. So if Fox News is your source, you're going to need to meet real people who are not that way, and you're going to have to learn. So keep on. I will be there with you.
Can I just say one thing with Fox News? Because I think before Obama was elected as president, I would watch Fox News twice, and I would watch CNN. And I had a friend who said to me, they would not speak to me again when he was watching Fox News. But what I thought was good about it was that it gave you sort of education on other people's perspectives. It may not be your own, but there are people who think a certain way. And part of being diverse is to listen and to understand other people's views and perspectives on stuff.
That's just ridiculous.
With this, I would like to call Debbie, and she can lead from here.